Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal. When Drew first heard the outcome of the custody trial falling in Michael's favor, he accepted it with a strange sense of inevitability but not suspicion. He had witnessed how the courtroom theatrics played out, how the judge leaned into Michael's narrative, how Willow's pleas, though sincere, seemed to vanish into a void of rehearsed counterarguments and polished legal maneuvers. Still, Drew chalked it up to strategy, to influence, perhaps even to luck. He never imagined, not for a moment, that something far more sinister had occurred beneath the surface. But fate, as always, had a way of revealing its hand to those who walked in circles of wealth, power, and backroom whispers. And Drew had long since secured a place in that world. A few days after the trial, as he reconnected with various contacts from his past ventures, people nestled deep in the folds of political and judicial infrastructure. He stumbled into a conversation that would reshape everything. One of his old acquaintances, once affiliated with the legal team of Jen Sidwell, casually mentioned an unusual transaction. At first, Drew didn't think much of it. But as the pieces came together, it became impossible to ignore. The acquaintance, unaware of the significance, mentioned a payment that Sidwell had authorized, something that coincided precisely with the timeline of the custody ruling. Drew pressed further. A second conversation led to an informal meeting with someone who had briefly interned in Sidwell's office, and what Drew uncovered next would leave him breathless. It wasn't just suspicion. It was confirmation. Sidwell had orchestrated a bribery scheme, one that targeted Judge Heron specifically. The judge had been compensated handsomely to render a decision that favored Michael, tipping the scales not based on merit, evidence, or the children's well-being, but in exchange for silent corruption. Drew sat in stunned silence as the weight of this revelation settled into his mind. Amelia and Wiley weren't taken from Willow because Michael was more capable or loving. They were taken because the justice system had been bought, and Drew now had proof of it. At first, Drew was consumed by fury. Not for Willow's sake, not entirely, but because this manipulation had disrupted his carefully calculated plan. He had envisioned himself as Willow's protector, her rescuer, the man who would stand by her side and help her regain what she had lost. But now he knew the loss wasn't genuine. It was artificial, staged, and reversible. If this information were to come to light, the entire trial would collapse. The judge would be disbarred. A new trial would be convened. And in the eyes of any impartial arbiter, Willow would have every legal and emotional advantage. She would most likely regain custody of Amelia and Wiley, on her own, without Drew's intervention. And with that independence would come clarity. She no longer needed him. It was that realization, as sharp as a blade across the soul, that awakened something dark within Drew. A gnawing hunger to control. A desperate need not to lose. He had spent months crafting the illusion of a perfect union. He had comforted Willow, whispered promises of justice, stood beside her in courtrooms, held her hand through loss. And now, he could see it all unraveling because of one corrupt man and one damning secret. So Drew made a decision. He buried the truth. Locked it away behind layers of silence and rationalization. He convinced himself that Willow needed stability more than she needed the truth. That exposing Sidwell would only throw the children into more chaos. That keeping silent was, in fact, a form of mercy. But deep down, Drew knew. He wasn't protecting Willow. He was protecting the illusion of control. The illusion of love. He began to move quickly. With the secret buried, he refocused his energy on the upcoming wedding. He escalated the preparations, pressured Willow subtly, insisting that the sooner they married, the stronger they could appear in front of the family court, should any appeals be necessary. He pretended that everything was fine. Better than fine. That their union was inevitable. That destiny was unfolding as it should. And Willow, still reeling from the trauma of losing her children, clung to that narrative, not realizing it was built on deceit. What Drew never anticipated, however, was Nina. To him, she had always been a nuisance, over-emotional, volatile, and constantly meddling in matters she barely understood. But Nina had spent her life surviving chaos, clawing her way through emotional wreckage, and she had learned to sense when something wasn't right. During a dinner at Metro Court, she noticed Sidwell exchanging glances with several high-profile legal figures, glances that lingered too long, filled with tension and coded meaning. Her instincts flared. Something was being concealed. And when Sidwell slipped into a private lounge with a man she didn't recognize, she followed. Not into the room, but close enough to overhear. The words were vague, coded, careful, but they were enough. Phrases like, "the judge played his part," and "no one suspects a thing," hung in the air like poison. Nina didn't wait. She hired a private investigator the next day. Within 48 hours, she had in her possession a cache of emails, financial records, and a partial transcript of an encrypted call. Everything pointed to Sidwell. Everything screamed bribery. And one particular document, buried deep in a corporate archive, revealed a disturbing truth: Drew had accessed those same records days earlier. He had known. Nina didn't hesitate. She confronted the family court with the evidence and petitioned for a new hearing. The response was immediate. Judge Heron was placed on indefinite suspension pending an ethics investigation. Sidwell was subpoenaed. And a special counsel was assigned to review every case Sidwell had touched over the past year. In the meantime, Willow was granted emergency reconsideration, and a temporary order was signed restoring her access to Amelia and Wiley. The wedding was cancelled. Not postponed, cancelled. Willow, holding the file Nina handed her, looked at Drew with something more painful than betrayal. She looked at him with pity. Because in that moment, she realized she had been used. Every embrace, every reassurance, every whispered vow had been weaponized. Drew hadn't stood by her because he believed in her. He had stood beside her to trap her. To own her. And she would never forgive that. Drew watched it all unravel with a fury that burned cold. He blamed Nina, of course. She had stolen his victory, shattered his plans. But beneath the anger was a creeping fear. Because Nina wasn't finished. She had begun to investigate not just the bribery, but Sidwell himself. His past. His connections. And what she was beginning to uncover made Drew nervous. Too nervous. Sidwell was no ordinary fixer. He had ties to shell corporations, hidden trusts, and offshore accounts connected to cases far outside Port Charles. His manipulation of the judicial system was just the tip of something darker. Something sprawling. And Nina, relentless, methodical, and emotionally driven, was now peeling back those layers. She was following the money. And if she kept going, she might find more than corruption. She might find Drew's fingerprints on deals he'd thought long buried. Now, as the fallout spread, Drew stood on the edge of a precipice. His grip on Willow was gone. His secret was exposed. And his alliance with Sidwell, once a source of power, had become a noose tightening around his neck. Nina, once dismissed as irrelevant, had become the most dangerous person in his world. And she wasn't stopping. Because now, it wasn't just about protecting Willow. It was about uncovering the truth. And for Drew, the truth was the one thing he had never learned how to control. Nina wasted no time after uncovering the damning evidence. Driven by a fiery mixture of maternal instinct and moral outrage, she immediately contacted the attorney currently representing Willow and handed over every document, audio clip, and financial record her investigator had uncovered. The file was complete and damning. Irrefutable proof that Sidwell had not only bribed Judge Heron but had done so with clear intent to manipulate the outcome of the custody case in Michael's favor. The legal team, upon reviewing the materials, recognized the magnitude of what they held. Within hours, they filed an emergency motion to reopen the custody case, citing judicial misconduct and the obstruction of justice as grounds for a new trial. The motion was accompanied by a formal complaint to the Judicial Oversight Committee, triggering an immediate internal review. The response from the court system was swift and chaotic. Once the motion was filed, it leaked almost instantly to the media. News outlets, both local and national, exploded with headlines about the alleged bribery scandal that had tainted a high-profile custody ruling in Port Charles. Within 24 hours, a firestorm of public outrage erupted. Parents, legal experts, and civil rights advocates flooded social media and broadcast networks with demands for accountability. Hashtags trended, protests formed outside the courthouse, and anonymous tips began pouring into hotlines, implicating other officials who may have known or looked the other way. Judge Heron was placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full ethics investigation, while Sidwell was subpoenaed to appear in front of a disciplinary tribunal for an emergency hearing on charges of judicial interference and criminal bribery. The court, facing immense public scrutiny and undeniable evidence, ruled to vacate the previous custody decision entirely and announced that a new trial would begin within days. This time, the proceedings would be presided over by an independent judge flown in from a different jurisdiction to avoid any appearance of bias. The court also mandated that all records of the previous trial be unsealed, allowing public access to transcripts, filings, and procedural evidence. For the first time, the process would be transparent, unclouded by corruption or hidden agendas. Willow, upon learning the full truth, was devastated. The betrayal pierced deeper than she had ever imagined. She had spent weeks in silent agony, believing that the only way to regain her children was to enter into a marriage with Drew, a man she once trusted with her vulnerability. And now, in one sickening instant, she realized that trust had been nothing but a manipulated illusion. The man she thought was standing beside her in solidarity had instead used her trauma as leverage, knowing all along that the trial had been rigged, and withholding that knowledge to bend her to his will. Her grief turned swiftly into fury. Without hesitation, Willow canceled the wedding. There was no room for doubt or negotiation. She removed the engagement ring, returned every gift, and revoked every plan tied to the ceremony. More than that, she severed all emotional and logistical ties with Drew. He was no longer her confidant or partner, he was a betrayer, a man who had orchestrated her continued suffering for the sake of a fantasy. Publicly and privately, she declared her position with crystal clarity: she would never forgive him. Not for the deceit, not for the manipulation, and especially not for using her love and desperation as weapons to imprison her in a false marriage. Drew, rather than retreat in shame, responded with unfiltered rage. He couldn't accept what was happening. That everything he had built, plotted, and rehearsed had crumbled because of Nina, a woman he had long dismissed as impulsive, emotionally volatile, and wholly unreliable. In his mind, she had always been a liability, a complication in Willow's life, someone to be tolerated but never feared. But now, faced with the carnage of his exposed plans, Drew was forced to confront a new reality. Nina was dangerous. Not because she was erratic, but because she was determined, strategic, and unrelenting when it came to protecting her daughter. And now she had power, legal, emotional, and social power, that Drew could no longer contain. Yet even as Drew reeled from the collapse of his relationship and the unraveling of his public image, Nina was not finished. Having dismantled the corrupt structure propping up the initial custody ruling, she turned her attention to the architect behind it. Sidwell. Something about him had always felt off, but now, with the bribery exposed, Nina began to question everything. Why had Sidwell risked so much to favor Michael? What did he stand to gain? And more importantly, why had Drew seemed so calm, even eerily complacent, in the weeks following the verdict? The glances Sidwell exchanged at Metro Court, the secrecy of his meetings, and his veiled comments began to form a pattern Nina could no longer ignore. With her instincts sharper than ever, Nina began a deeper investigation. She cross-referenced Sidwell's previous court dealings, financial transactions, and known associates. What she uncovered was far more troubling than she had imagined. Sidwell's influence extended well beyond one corrupt judge. He had embedded himself in a network of legal consultants, forensic experts, and property developers. Several companies connected to Drew were found to share financial ties with shell corporations linked to Sidwell. It was no longer clear who was manipulating whom, or whether Drew was a knowing participant or an expendable pawn. The more Nina uncovered, the more she suspected that the bribery case was merely a cover for a much larger operation. One that used the family court system as a staging ground for laundering money, silencing dissenters, and controlling outcomes for clients with the deepest pockets. There were whispers of other custody cases, guardianship disputes, and estate transfers all involving the same players. And at the center of it all was Sidwell, his polished image now crumbling under the weight of potential federal scrutiny. Nina's concern grew when she realized she might also be a target. If Sidwell had orchestrated this much corruption with Drew as his ally or pawn, what would he do now that she had disrupted everything? Her investigation had exposed powerful people, and retaliation was a very real threat. But Nina was not someone easily intimidated. She doubled her security, encrypted her communications, and worked more closely with her investigator to ensure that every document, every recording, and every witness statement was legally protected and ready for court submission. Her mission had shifted, from protecting Willow to dismantling the corrupt empire that had victimized not only her daughter, but countless others. In the end, what began as a mother's instinct to shield her daughter from emotional harm evolved into a crusade for justice. Nina had pierced through the shadows of wealth, deception, and political influence, and she wasn't stopping until every secret was unearthed and every culprit held accountable. Drew, once the orchestrator of a carefully constructed illusion, now found himself ensnared in a web of exposure, one that threatened to destroy not only his relationship with Willow but his freedom, his reputation, and every ounce of control he had clung to for so long. Nina had become the reckoning none of them saw coming, and for the first time, the truth was no longer something to fear, but the only weapon worth wielding. Nina, driven by a storm of intuition, grief, and a relentless thirst for the truth, turned inward to revisit the past. She returned to a small, locked drawer in the back of her closet, an archive of secrets, whispers, and buried betrayals. Years ago, during a particularly dark chapter of her life, she had received a stack of confidential documents from an anonymous source. At the time, she hadn't fully understood their implications. They hinted at corruption in another city. Real estate fraud, estate misappropriations, forged medical documents, all seemingly unconnected, all too tangled to untie. But something in her gut had told her to hold on to them. And now, as she traced the contours of Sidwell's role in the recent bribery scandal, the patterns began to re-emerge with terrifying clarity. She laid the old documents out on her dining table, next to the newer evidence gathered in the custody case, and began piecing them together like a puzzle. As she reviewed names, bank accounts, legal dockets, and signatures, a chilling realization took shape. Sidwell was no mere fixer. He was part of a well-funded, deeply entrenched interest group that had previously infiltrated another city's inheritance court system. There, they'd manipulated elderly estates, redirected inheritance funds, and used corrupt judges to assign legal guardianships to third parties for profit. The more she read, the clearer it became. Sidwell had not left that operation behind, he had simply transplanted it, and now he was rebuilding that same corrupt machine in Port Charles, brick by brick, using the family court as his new foundation. Willow's case, Nina realized, was just the beginning. She wasn't targeted out of spite or coincidence, she was a strategic pawn. Young, recently reconnected with her mother, vulnerable from medical trauma and family loss, and caught between two powerful men, she was the perfect candidate to be manipulated. Gaining control over Amelia and Wiley meant gaining leverage over two influential families, Michael's and Drew's. But it was Drew's recent decisions that began to disturb Nina the most. She traced his financial steps over the past 3 months and discovered a string of investments, shell companies, and sudden asset transfers that perfectly overlapped with Sidwell's recent rise in influence. Each transaction was shrouded in complexity, real estate holdings under obscure names, offshore accounts rerouted through charities, LLCs tied to defunct corporations in cities Sidwell had previously operated in. At first, Nina tried to give Drew the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he had been fooled. Maybe Sidwell had manipulated him, too. But as the timeline sharpened, that illusion crumbled. Drew hadn't just benefited from the system, he had positioned himself within it, quietly amassing power through the same corrupt channels that had just ripped Willow's life apart. The realization sent a deep, cold shiver down Nina's spine. This was no longer about a mother trying to protect her daughter. This was a systemic cancer. If Drew was involved, knowingly or otherwise, then his proximity to Willow was not just emotionally dangerous but legally and ethically catastrophic. Nina saw the full scope now. They weren't just trying to control one woman's children. They were creating a framework to dominate Port Charles itself. Through strategic legal appointments, manufactured custody battles, falsified court records, and manipulated estate disputes, they could seize homes, businesses, and reputations without a single gunshot, only signatures and sealed files. But Nina was no longer the woman who once blindly stumbled through grief and regret. She had survived lies, betrayals, and manipulations that would have broken others. And now, faced with this monstrous design, she felt a furious clarity unlike anything she had ever experienced. Her anger burned with purpose, but it was no longer rooted solely in what had been done to Willow. It now encompassed everyone who stood to lose their autonomy, their families, or their livelihoods under this looming shadow of orchestrated corruption.